I'm Heather Pulser, and I'm with the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Pueblo County.
And I'm Amy Moran, and I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Thank you so much for logging into this module today. We are going to be talking about suicide. Suicide is a really tough topic, and Amy and I both realize that as you're sitting there going through this, there may come a point when something is triggering to you, or you may have some thoughts run through your head. We are going to have Colorado Crisis Services. The number will be scrolling across the bottom of your screen throughout this entire presentation. If at any time you need to stop, please give them a call or send them a text so that you have someone to talk to. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to talk about suicide. A lot of times adults don't talk with youth about suicide. There's a big fear around that. But we know that it's really important and it's something that impacts your life. And so we find it is very important for us to discuss that. So why? In a given year, we know that in a typical high school class of 40 students, that 6 will seriously consider suicide. 5 will make a plan. 3 will make at least 1 attempt, and 1 will make an attempt sufficiently harmful enough to require medical attention. We know that suicide is impacting you and those around you, and that's why it's important to learn the warning signs and to know how to get help.
When we talk about the topic of suicide, it's important to talk about some of the what we call myths that are out there that can sometimes contribute to us not talking about suicide. Through some of the myths and then talk about the actual facts that dispel those misbeliefs. The first one, no one can stop a suicide. If someone wants to die, they're just going to figure out a way to do it. So there's a myth that it's just inevitable. But the fact is that if people in a crisis get the help they need, they will probably never be suicidal again. Connection, intervention, and effective treatments do exist. A second myth, confronting a person or asking about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. So if I ask someone if they're feeling that way, what if I make them mad and they end up feeling even more suicidal? But the fact is that asking someone directly about suicide or the intent to take their own life, it lowers the person's anxiety. And it opens up communication, and it lowers the risk of someone doing something impulsively without thinking all the way through the consequences. There's another myth that only experts or professionals can prevent suicide. But the truth is, many times, experts and the professionals are in the dark and they don't know that this person is suffering. So it takes us as loved ones and friends and peers that when we see some signs and we know of some risk factors, that we go ahead and ask the question. So suicide prevention is everybody's business, and anyone can help prevent that tragedy.
The next myth in regards to suicide is that suicidal people keep their plans to themselves. The fact is that most people who are suicidal will communicate their intent sometime during the week prior. A lot of times when somebody dies by suicide, we look at it and we think, gosh, we had no idea, we didn't see it coming. What happens is that communication often gets lost because we don't know what to look for. So we are going to cover what that communication looks like so you know what to be on the lookout for. The next myth is those who talk about suicide don't do it. This is a big one. We know, especially with youth, it becomes part of your everyday talk, right? Gosh, I'm just going to go shoot myself, or, I'm going to go home and die, or, we say these things just in everyday conversation that we forget that sometimes there might be some real intent behind that. So it's really important that we understand that people who make these comments, they may actually have the intent to try or even complete an act of self-destruction. So it's really important when we hear these things, even if we think somebody's joking, that we stop and ask them, hey, Do you really mean that, or are you joking around? Like trying to get from them if there was any intent. The next myth is that once a person decides to complete suicide, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. What we have learned from people who have attempted suicide and survived is that they did not want to die. They just wanted the pain to stop and they didn't know how to make it stop. So if we know that suicide is the most preventable kind of death and that almost any positive action may save a life. The last myth in regards to suicide that we're going to discuss today is that if a suicidal youth tells a friend, that friend will access help. This is a big one because what we have learned is that most young people never tell an adult. We're going to bring this up many times throughout this presentation. It is extremely important that you get an adult involved. Now, an adult can be a trusted adult that the other person that's struggling, you may ask them, is there an adult that we can talk to? And if there's not a trusted adult in that person's life, think about your life. Is there a trusted adult in your life that you can go talk to and bring this person to with your concerns? If neither one of you has an adult that you trust with this information, then I need you to call the Colorado Crisis Service line at the bottom of your screen. You can call together or you can call individually and let them know that this person is struggling. If your friend or somebody that you know is struggling with suicidal ideation and they make you promise not to tell somebody, I need you to call Safe to Tell. It is extremely important. Safe to Tell has interrupted many suicides that were in action, and as a result of that, those youth are still alive today. There is a possibility that your friend might get mad, but that friend will be alive, and that is what is important.
Suicide is such a hard topic, and it leaves many of us asking the question, why? Why would someone think about ending their life? And what we know is that there's not one single reason that causes people to get that way. There is a common thread of pain, the concept of pain. Pain, we know, can come in various forms. We've all experienced some form of physical pain. Even stubbing your toe is an example of an ouch, a physical pain. But we also, as humans, can experience psychological pain. And at times that pain can cause such feelings of misery and anguish that individuals are left with feeling that dying is their only escape from that pain. However, we know that there are ways to help yourself feel better. Another common thread with individuals who have attempted suicide and survived, or people who have dealt with suicidal thoughts, and then they're able to get through that and no longer have those anymore, is that they tell us that there was a point in their life where they felt hopeless and helpless. But these are individuals who found hope again. Suicide is not the problem, but it is most of the time, it is the perceived solution to the problem. What we know is that there are many ways to solve problems, and suicide is not the answer.
So we're going to talk a little bit about triggers, and I mentioned this word earlier, and what I mean by that is if somebody's struggling with things in general, there are things called triggers that really set off those feelings and those thoughts and those emotions. So we're going to talk about what some of those triggers might be. So I want to start out talking about identity struggles. Middle school and high school is a time when you're really developing your identity. What kinds of things do you like? Who are you? Who do you love? What kind of people do you like to be around? Who do you want to be? And sometimes that aligns perfectly with what you had hoped, and it aligns perfectly with your family. But we know a lot of times it doesn't. And there can be some conflict within your family, your community, or even within your own self that makes your identity creation a struggle and it becomes difficult. For example, and this could be any kind of identity, but I want to spend a moment talking about our LGBTQ plus community. We know that within that community that 61.3% of teenagers in Colorado who identify as being LGBTQ plus have reported feeling sad or hopeless. 46.3% have considered suicide. 25.4% have attempted suicide in the previous 12 months. And 35% of transgender students have attempted suicide this previous year. If you or someone you care about is LGBTQ+, there is a fantastic resource called the Trevor Project, and we will give you that resource towards the end. But I encourage you to reach out to the Trevor Project, and they have their own 1-800 number that you can call at any point in time if you are struggling.
In life, we experience things that cause anxiety. We also experience stressful moments. Life can be hard, and life can be extremely enjoyable as well. In normal times, we have high levels of stress and anxiety. And then you bring on a pandemic, and that has just increased everybody's levels of what they're experiencing when it comes to negative emotions. And so when people are feeling high levels of stress and anxiety, that can be another trigger that drives them to be feeling suicidal. But what we know is that there are effective ways to manage stress and manage anxiety and to help all of us feel better. And when we can start to do those things, we can learn ways to not be thinking about taking our own lives.
So earlier I had mentioned that most people who take their own lives communicate their intent sometime during the week prior. So communication comes in many forms. So we're going to talk about what that communication may look like. So the most obvious form of communication is verbal, right? So it is possible that somebody may tell you directly that they are thinking of taking their own lives. They are thinking of suicide. They are thinking of dying. But they may also say some things indirectly. You may hear things like, I'm so tired, I just can't do this anymore. Or somebody saying, pretty soon you're not going to have to worry about me. When we hear these things, it may make us worry a little bit, but our thoughts don't necessarily go to suicide. So I encourage you, when you hear somebody make these statements, that you stop for a minute and you ask them, are you okay? And have a real conversation around that.
There's also what we call behavioral signs. So things that people do that may be an indicator that they're really having a hard time. And such a hard time that it could lead them to a crisis type situation. So some of these signs or some of these behaviors that we're talking about that we've known to be able to look for. If we know that someone has tried to harm themselves or kill themselves in the past, we know that that can be a risk factor and a behavior that we know about that can make things get bad again. If we know that someone has been asking about a weapon, in particular a gun, maybe they're asking you if you know where they could find a gun. Anything that someone says where it brings about the element of danger, then that would be a warning sign and something that you need to at least clue in on. We've known that people have saved medications or saved pills in order to try to overdose in an attempt to take their own life. Sometimes we've known of people who will give away their most favorite thing that they own. And sometimes that happens and it's just a gesture of a good gift, right? Maybe they got the new version of the latest Xbox, and so they're ready to give you, their friend, their old one. And so sometimes it's an innocent gift giving. But if someone that you know has been more isolated, less talkative, maybe seeming down, and they give away something, then that would be a sign and something that we want to pay attention to. Something called impulsive behaviors or risk-taking behaviors. So when I mentioned the element of danger, so dangerous behaviors, maybe they're using drugs and alcohol, and that's not a normal behavior for them. Things like driving a car recklessly. Those are examples of risky behavior. And impulsive behavior can be impulsive behavior is a concern because that's when people are not stopping to think before they act. Also, sometimes people have experienced irritability or anger, and this comes about because they are really agitated and feeling like they're just done with everything. But so many times we equate or we correlate someone who is feeling suicidal that they must be depressed. And so we don't view someone who may be increasingly angry as a sign.
Another way that people somewhat communicate that we don't have to think about is through situations. We call these the last straw. So if somebody's already struggling and they're having some thoughts of suicide or they're living with some kind of psychological pain, when these things happen, these things tend to send them over the edge. So it's really important when these things happen that we're paying attention. The first one is this, that the person is expelled from school. A loss of a major relationship. This can be any kind of relationship. It can be romantic, it could be a friendship, it can be a family, it can be the loss of a pet. The death of a cherished individual. Death is a very hard thing to deal with, and grief hits us really hard sometimes. And so it's extremely important that we understand that if somebody is struggling, is now dealing with grief, that is an added factor. An unexpected loss of freedom or a fear of punishment are other situational clues.
Also, a diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness. Financial problems, and this can be either their own or maybe their family has experienced some type of financial impact. Feeling embarrassed or humiliated in front of peers. A victim of assault or some type of aggression, or a victim of bullying. And we know that bullying is happening through social media platforms. And just like the video mentioned at the beginning of this module, the young girl mentioned she just wished that, looking back on it, she would have just deleted her Snapchat, and that would have ended her exposure to the bullying. And I just want to say that I know that that step might be hard, but if doing something that ends up making you feel better, then doing that is worth it.
Some other areas of concern or ways that may clue you in that somebody is struggling. If you see any change in interaction with family and friends, somebody who's usually very outgoing and all of a sudden they don't want to talk to anybody. This can also be the opposite. If you have somebody who's more introverted and generally pretty quiet and all of a sudden they're doing the opposite. Any big changes should clue you in that something is going on with them. A recent disappointment or rejection, a sudden decline in academic performance, increased apathy. Apathy meaning they just don't care, right? So if you have somebody who's usually pretty put together and you notice they haven't been showering and they're kind of, disheveled and they just don't care anymore, that's a pretty big sign that something's going on with them. This next one, physical symptoms. Science has shown us that there is a direct correlation between our brains and our body, and that trauma and stress lives in our bodies. So if there is not a medical explanation for things like headaches or chronic stomach pains or insomnia or sleep issues or eating issues, we want everybody to go to the doctor first and make sure there's not a medical reason. But if there's not a medical explanation, that does not make these things any less real. What that means is that stress and that trauma and that pain is living itself out through these things. So we tend to, when somebody who's chronically sick all the time or has stomach aches or headaches, it's really easy for us to say, they're just faking it or they're a hypochondriac. But that is a very real pain for them. And so we need to understand that there's something going on in their brain that is causing that. So all of the things that we have just gone over that people communicate, they may not be signs of suicide, right? That person may not want to die, but they're still showing these signs. So, but all of these signs that we have discussed do require some exploration and some concern, and they're worthy of you checking in with your friend or loved one to make sure that they are okay.
Many times we don't talk about suicide because we're afraid to. We're afraid to bring it up. And this goes back into the myths that I mentioned earlier. There's this belief that if I ask someone about it, that maybe I'm going to plant the seed and that's what's going to make them start to think about it. But we know that that's not true. So many times when people are feeling that low and that scared, there's a lot of feelings of shame and guilt, and they feel like they are a burden, or they perceive that they are a burden. And so they won't bring it up. And another belief that can contribute to us being scared to talk about suicide is that we think that the person is not really serious, that they're just saying that. But really, we do need to take all signs as at least something that needs to be, just like Heather said, just like asking someone, are you okay?
So how do you start this conversation with someone? As Amy said, it's scary, right? If we see somebody we care about is struggling, we want to help them, but we're afraid sometimes to get involved. So how do you start that conversation? The first thing is you need to find an appropriate time to connect. Understanding that this person is really in some pain and there may be some fear and some guilt behind that, we want to find an appropriate time and an appropriate place to connect with them. So make sure it's somewhere comfortable and somewhere quiet where there's not other people around. And share your concerns. Tell them, these are the things that I've seen. This is why I'm worried about you. I've noticed you've been making a lot of statements about being hopeless. I've noticed that you just don't seem to care anymore. You haven't been coming around as much. That makes me really worried about you. And then ask them, are you thinking of suicide? Are you thinking of dying? And if they are, or they tell you they're not okay or they're struggling, you just need to listen. You don't have to have the answers. You just need to listen and remain non-judgmental. People have reasons for dying and reasons for being in pain that may not make a lot of sense to you. But for them, it is a big deal, and it's making them want to not to live anymore. And then after you've listened in an empathetic manner, you need to connect them with an adult. And I'm going to stress this again. A trusted adult can be anybody that that person considers a trusted adult. It can be a family member, a teacher. It can be a program director at the Boys and Girls Club or an adult at the Y. If that person cannot name any adult that they feel safe telling this information to, who's a trusted adult in your life? And can you go to that person? And if the answer once again is no, there are still options. At that point in time, you need to either call or text Colorado Crisis Services, the number running across the bottom of your screen, or if the person tells you that they're making you promise not to tell anybody, or they tell you not to tell anybody, you need to make a report to Safe to Tell.
So how do we ask the question? Well, the first thing to do is you can just come out and directly ask, are you thinking about suicide? Another thing you could say is, are you planning to kill yourself? And it's important to be able to come right out and ask those questions. Because again, it reduces the feelings of guilt and shame, and it opens the other person up to where they feel like they can start to talk about it. Then listen without judgment. And remember that sometimes people who are contemplating suicide are not thinking rationally. And so connect them with an adult who can help.
I do want to briefly say we really encourage you, and we're going to, as we've been encouraging you throughout, to really have conversations with people and to ask them. But please remember that words have power. And so we need to make sure we're not saying things like it's all in your head. Snap out of it. What's wrong with you? And those all sound mean, right? But there are some that don't sound mean that we often don't think about. When we say to someone, but you have so much to live for, right? That sounds empathetic and that sounds caring. But what you're doing is telling that person that that pain is not valid. And so it's really important that we choose words that are encouraging them to talk and are giving them the safety and the freedom to speak.
So statements like, you are important to me. You are not alone. I'm here for you. We'll get through this together. And lastly, I'm going to help you find someone to help. And I just want to explain that although you may be the friend who is hearing the information, that doesn't mean that you're the person who has to solve their problems or has to make sure that they will never be suicidal again or to take those feelings away. The main step you want to take is to help the person feel like you are connected to them and you will help them get help.
So we've talked about what if somebody around you is having thoughts of suicide. So we want to take a moment to talk about you. What if you are having thoughts of suicide? First, we want you to know that it is okay to not be okay. Have some grace with yourself and know that no matter how it may seem, you are not alone. We know that it feels like these feelings will never end, but please know that things can get better. Hold on to hope with everything you have. Then tell someone. If there's not someone you feel safe telling, call Colorado Crisis Services. No feelings are too small or too insignificant to talk about. And then lastly, seek help. There are resources available to make these feelings more bearable and to support you while you need it.
Sometimes what keeps us from going to get help is because we don't know what to expect or we don't know what will happen. So I just want to share a few things about what therapy can be like or what counseling can be like. The very first appointment, you should be ready to talk about your health history and what you are experiencing. Be clear about what you want and need to get better. You may be asked to fill out a questionnaire or 2 or 3 describing your mental health experience. Ask the mental health professional to explain treatment options so that you understand the plan and what you need to do. You have a choice and you are in control. If you have questions, ask.
So we want to leave you with some resources. Colorado Crisis Services, the number that has been strolling across the bottom of your screen, is a free, confidential, 24-hour service. You can call that number or text TALK to 38255 at any time. It does not have to be a suicidal crisis. If you are experiencing feelings of depression or anxiety or loneliness, you can call or text that number and there's somebody on the other side to talk to you. You also don't need to be the person in crisis. If you are concerned with somebody that you care about, you can call and text this number as the person who is trying to help, and you can ask them how to help, and they will walk you through what you need to do. As mentioned earlier, the Trevor Lifeline is part of the Trevor Project. Once again, this is a 24-hour number that you can call and they will help you. This phone number is answered from people that are within the LGBTQ plus community. So there's not a fear that many people in this community have of seeking help from mental health professionals. There is also their website, which is the trevorproject.org, that has a lot of resources on it as well. Health Solutions in Pueblo County also has a 24-hour line. Now it says on here crisis line. I do want to preface this by saying this number is answered 24 hours a day, but it is not answered as a crisis line. So when somebody answers the phone, when you call this number, ask to be connected with crisis. At that time, they will connect you over to crisis services. And at that time, you can chat with somebody 24 hours a day. There are people that are available to talk to you. As we've mentioned before, safe to tell. If somebody that you are concerned about is thinking about dying, you need to make and they are not willing to get help, and there is not an adult that they are willing to tell, you do need to contact Safe to Tell and make a report. I wanted to add a couple of websites just for you to look at that give you some more resources. The first one is nowmattersnow.com. If you are not in an immediate suicidal crisis and you're just struggling with some thoughts of depression or anxiety, this is a great website. And Amy has mentioned several times about taking care of yourself and that there are things that help these feelings feel more bearable. So Now Matters Now is a great free website that has some things to help you with that. The last resource is PuebloSuicidePrevention.org. Through the Suicide Prevention Coalition of Pueblo County, we were able to launch this website that is specific to Pueblo County. But when you go to that website, if you are somebody who is struggling with suicidal thoughts, or you know somebody who's having suicidal thoughts, there is a lot of things on this website that can help you and connect you to help. And then because we want to leave you with something fun, we're going to leave you with a free app because free phone apps are always fun. This free phone app is called Virtual Hope Box. You can download it on any smartphone device. And what it is a chance to have something at your fingertips to help when you are going through something triggering. When something triggers you and your mind is starting to play tricks on you, this is a great resource to have on your phone. So if you look at it, the black box there, it says Remind Me. And when you push that button, you can upload anything like songs or video clips or pictures, anything that makes you feel comforting or brings you kind of back to yourself or something that makes you laugh. You can upload those things into that box. The green box Distract Me just has some little fidgety games. I know I myself, I'm not a fan of social situations, and so it's nice to have something to fidget with, so that's what the green box allows for. The pink box, or the yellow box, says Inspire Me. That just has some inspirational quotes for those of you that love inspirational quotes. There's a bunch in there for you. The blue box, Relax Me. It has some meditation apps as well as a visual breathing app that will tell you breathe in and breathe out. And then the pink box has coping tools. So if there's something specific that you know works for you, you can put it in there. The last thing that's on this app that is pretty great is up in the right-hand corner, there's a little phone icon. And when you press that phone icon, it will take you to a page where you can upload contacts of the safe people in your life, people you can reach out to and talk to if you are struggling.
Well, that wraps up the presentation for Heather and I. And we just want to thank you so much for tuning in and giving us an opportunity to share information with you. Suicide is not an easy topic to talk about, but we like to close our presentation by saying that suicide is the most preventable death and that we all have a little hope that we can share and spread. Thank you guys so much.